Welcome to episode 2 of this special journey into the youth of Chopin. We are with Michael Moran, author and adventurer, talking about Chopin's youth.
So Michael, you've taken us to one of the most iconic parts of Warsaw, Warsaw's Old Town, to show us something, but there's nothing to look at here.
No, but there was something very important, which was the Warsaw High School for Music. It was all here. It extended from the Church of St. Anne to the Royal Castle. And that was where, in fact, but it was demolished in 1840, so we don't see it. But there were two very important aspects. Not only did Chopin study composition with his great teacher Joseph Elsner, but who had an apartment in this former monastery, but also his inaccessible love, Konstancja Gładowska, also had an apartment here, and undoubtedly, because he accompanied her as a singer, he would have visited her in her apartment almost certainly.
So we have Chopin's first love, and where he perfects his craft, as it were, as a student at least. I guess it's amazing when you think about it. The tourists here in Warsaw don't know they're walking on a piece of Chopin's history.
No, September 1826 he came here.
And Michael, you've brought an example of the mischievous Chopin, an example from one of his holiday adventures. You mentioned he already went to Żelazowa Wola on holiday, but this is from a different place.
This is Szafania, which is about 180 kilometers northwest of Warsaw. And he decided to produce a type of ironical newspaper based on the Warszawa Courier, and he called it the Szafania Courier.
And you've got an example.
And I'd like to read a couple of extracts from this, because it's very amusing what he wrote. Let's have a look here. August the 13th, 1824. Szafania Courier. Herbeta played on the piano with uncommon talent. This Berlin virtuoso plays in the same style as Herr Berger, the pianist from Skolimów. In sheer velocity he surpasses Madame Lagowska, and he plays with such feeling that almost every note seems to come not from his heart, but from his enormous stomach. Home News, passed by the censor, issue of August 27th. The Honourable Mr. Pichon has encountered all kinds of unpleasantness from mosquitoes. They are biting him all over, but fortunately not on the nose, or it would have become even longer than it already is. And another one about animals. He liked to write about nature, you know. The drake sneaked out of the hen house early in the morning and drowned. The reason for this suicide is not yet known, because the family is refusing to talk. And so on. A very amusing temperament, and no one associates this type of thing with the deep night of the soul, if you understand what I mean.
And do you hear this cheekiness, this mischievousness in his music sometimes?
In his earlier music, it's very playful, yes. The music he wrote in what was known as the Style Brilliant, it does have this it's a superficial glitter, but it's also very tasteful and very charming and very witty. And I think he was quite witty. I brought you to the Church of the Nuns of the Visitation because it's important in Chopin's youth. After he performed at the Augsburg Evangelical Church on the Aeolo Melodicon, because the Aeolo Melodicon had organ pipes, if you remember.
Yes.
And so he was offered the post of organist in this church.
Right here?
Yes. But he was a great improviser. So consequently, he would improvise, and in one occasion during the Mass, he got so carried away that the priest had to send a message saying, "Chopin, please stop improvising." Inside, because the organ fingering that Chopin sometimes penciled on his students' manuscripts creeps into his playing, and I think his role as an organist influenced the way he approached the piano, particularly in the legato lines, because in organ playing you have to maintain a complete legato, And you do it without a pedal, of course, which he did often in his fingering in the piano, for the piano. And it's my private theory, of course.
So we know that, well, we suspect that Chopin died of some form of tuberculosis-related illness.
Yes.
Did he contract this disease in Warsaw?
He probably did, but it appeared, the first signs of this began to appear in 1826. The extraordinary thing about Chopin's tuberculosis is that it lasted for so long. If you suffered from tuberculosis, like his sister Emilia, this terrible disease took her so quickly. She was such a talented girl, you know, musical, wonderful sense of literature, could write poetry. She was glorious. And he had to watch her die, of course, of tuberculosis. It must have had a great effect on him.
So you have this 16-year-old boy who's having to watch his sister die from a terrible illness. It must have affected his family and him as a person.
Yes, his mother, in fact, wore mourning all her life after Emilia died. Everyone was so fond of this wonderful child.
Do you think, therefore, that some of the pain that we hear in Chopin's music, this longing, perhaps also might be a personal reflection of his loss in his family?
Well, what I think it is that, you know, in childhood and young adulthood, we all think the world operates perfectly until the first signs of disillusionment. And, you know, we are not as close to death as they were. I mean, people were very close to death. It was not hidden. You didn't die in hospitals and so on. Right, this tuberculosis was one of the reasons why they all went for a cure to what is now known as Dušniky-Zdroj, but in those days it was in Silesia. It was called Bad Reinherz. It was recommended by Joseph Elsner, his teacher. Right, we're now, I wanted to show you this memorial, although it's quite modern.
Yes.
It has its own history. And in fact, in May, they have many concerts here of Chopin recitals. By some of them are eminent pianists. And they put a piano on that podium there with an umbrella in case it rains. And people sit here. If we look over there, there are many, many benches now. But when I came here first in 1992, you just had your picnic and you sat on the lawn, and it was terribly intimate and so charming because all of these rose bushes, so the entire area would be carpeted in roses. In 1908, the Russian authorities decided to give permission for a monument to Chopin. And there was a competition, and it was won by Władysław Szymanowski, a Pole. Unfortunately, the First World War interrupted the casting of this monument. And the odd thing was that the full-scale model was cut in half. One half went to Krakow and the other half went to France. And then they were not reunited until after the war, after the First World War. And in 1926, there was an unveiling ceremony of the complete monument as we see it today, as we see it. So I'd like to read a little passage by a cleric who was present at that ceremony. All our past sings in him. All our slavery cries in him. The beating heart of the nation, the great king of our sorrows.
And do we know why was the statue created the way it was? What was that?
Well, this was supposed, if you know Mazovia well enough, you know that there's quite a lot of wind there. It's quite a windy place because it's quite flat. And the willow tree, which is over Chopin's head, you can see the prevailing wind is blowing it over him like that. It's just to give a feeling of movement, and it's particularly characteristic of the area we are in Warsaw, of Mazovia.
Do you think it captures his music as well?
Yes, it does. It captures certain parts of the mazurkas. The mazurkas, of course, are very characteristic of Mazovia, and not only the folk dancing, but also I drove a lot around Mazovia in my car with mazurkas playing, and I understood everything in this way. You have to go to the landscape to understand the music. I've always said this to students, that they should come to Poland. You can't experience Chopin and understand him unless you do.
Chopin starts to begin travelling, start exploring new worlds, and eventually decides to leave Warsaw.
Yes, because I think, like all young men, he had career prospects. It's very simple. And I think he wanted to make a good career move, so he began to explore outside of Poland.
Where did he go first on his major trips?
In 1828, 1829, he travelled to Berlin, and he also travelled to Vienna. Where he had, in Vienna, he met an important publisher. They were very impressed with his playing, particularly in Vienna. In his farewell concert, before he left Poland, we are again reminded of this wonderful relationship, probably unrequited love relationship with Konstancja Gładkowska. In the slow movement of both the F minor concerto and the E minor concerto, he speaks of revelry in the moonlight, and also the idea that in the E minor it was called a romance. He never wrote another movement called romance. He referred to this movement as a spot which calls to mind 1,000 happy memories. And Elsner, on the farewell day, which was November the 2nd, 1830, he had composed a cantata for small male choir and also for guitar. And at this time, he performed this for Elsner, performed this for Chopin as he left the country. It must have been a very moving moment, because shortly afterwards, the 29th of November, there was an uprising against the Russians, which made Chopin suffer immensely.
And Chopin was able to come back, or?
No, he never came back to Poland. He never returned to Poland.
So I imagine that some of the melancholy, the sadness we can hear in his music.
Of course, all of it almost came from a nostalgia for the past halcyon days of his life, which were his youth, really.
And sadly, of course, Chopin dies, but yet a little piece of him does return to Poland.
He was buried in Père Lachaise, but one of his great fears was that he would be buried alive. And he said, please remove my heart. And his sister decided to smuggle the heart out of France. She had to smuggle it out under her dress to get it across the border. And she smuggled it back into Poland. It's an extraordinary story in detail.
And now it lies at the Holy Cross Church in Warsaw.
And in Warsaw, yes, behind a small plaque and a memorial to him. The heart itself is an extraordinary symbol, I think, of the Polish heart. It really is the Polish heart itself. And oddly enough, it was in fact protected by an SS officer during the Second World War. They removed it so that if the church was bombed, it wouldn't be. I mean, that's really surprising to me. And then it was brought back ceremonially. And there's been a sort of interest in why Chopin died. And many people think, of course, it was tuberculosis, but actually it was a complication of tuberculosis known as pericarditis, which was inflammation around the heart, a membrane around the heart.
So we've got this inscription here, and it says, what is this? It says that the statue of Frederick Chopin that was destroyed and stolen by the Germans in the 31st of May 1940 has been rebuilt by the whole nation, and that's in 1946. So what happened?
Well, they saw Chopin as a subversive political power, which he had been always, since he started composing polonaises. Everyone regarded him, even in the 19th century, as having a political function. And in many of his works, he included subversive military-type songs and songs that encouraged people to be together. To rebuild this memorial, they had to try and, they could hardly do it from photographs, but they actually found a miniature of the original casting, and they were able to reconstruct this. The story is a bit more involved than that, but it's a very interesting story, really, and actually very symbolic, I think. Symbolic.
I imagine if you were an inhabitant of Warsaw, then knowing that Poland's composer had been destroyed here, it must have had such an effect on your morale, because it's such a symbol of Poland, and the Germans, of course, knew that.
But that's the difference between Chopin and any other composer of any other nation. he has a function in Polish psyche that is absolutely unique in any country in the world for a composer. I mean, even Tchaikovsky to the Russians doesn't have this type of multifaceted significance, really. And for me, this has always been a symbol of Polish history. Construction, destruction, reconstruction.
Michael, thank you very much for taking us through the journey of Chopin's youth. Again, it's been a personal privilege to spend time with you, getting to know Chopin, a person I thought I knew quite well, but actually didn't. I know he's meant so much to you, and his music means so much to so many people around the world, that frankly speaking, on behalf of all the viewers of this programme, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, because I wanted the opportunity to mention how important formative influences are and how important it is to come to Poland if you really want to understand Chopin.
Well, I think you'd agree, so we invite you to Warsaw now, and we also invite you to watch the other episodes in the Heart of Poland series. We've got fascinating discussions with fascinating people leading fascinating lives, and please do make sure that you share them on with anyone you think might be interested in discovering the Heart of Poland.